Hello everyone, and welcome to the 114th episode of Analyzing Evil, featuring Raoul Silva from Skyfall. While he might not be the most iconic Bond villain, nor is he the first, he is the one I've seen requested the most to be featured in one of these episodes. And if you've seen Skyfall, it's easy to see why. Raoul is brutal, elegant, and mesmerizing to watch, and he sets himself apart from other Bond villains in his relative complexity. He's not twirling his mustache as he details his plan to dominate the world, or killing people at will for the sake of lining his own pockets, which, admittedly, are motives that have made some fantastic villains. But instead, Raoul is a tragic character on a quest for revenge, a man whose life was decided for him and then cast aside by the woman who shaped him into what he was. And in this video, we're going to explore how that happened and why it caused Raoul to seek out both self-destruction and his ultimate revenge. Without further ado, let's begin. Raoul Silva, whose true name is Tiago Rodrigues, was likely born in either Brazil or Portugal, but it's possible that he was born in the UK and that he's just a Lusophone by heritage. But regardless of the circumstances of his birth, he was eventually picked up as an orphan by M and MI6 to be molded into the perfect spy, much like his proverbial brother, James Bond. Stationed in Hong Kong from 1986 to 1997, Raoul was by his own admission one of the best agents of his time, and his rather long career in covert ops and his success as a criminal mastermind could be an indicator that he in fact was. Unfortunately for him, right around the time the British were handing control of Hong Kong back over to China, Raoul's cover was blown and he was severely punished via torture by who we can assume to be the Chinese government. For 5 long months, Raoul languished under the torment inflicted upon him by his captors, holding out hope that the woman who would become like a mother to him would save him from this hell. But help never came, and Raoul, rightly so, attributed this not to M's inability to rescue him, but to her unwillingness to do so for her own aims, as Raoul knew full well that MI6 was more than capable of aiding him in his time of need. Realizing that the only way he'd be able to free himself from his suffering would be to crush the cyanide capsule concealed in his back left molar, Raoul made his peace with the world and crushed the tooth. But upon doing so, he found only more pain, more than he could have ever imagined, as this caustic gas permeated every fiber of his being, burning his insides and horrifically scarring his face. Somehow, Raoul survived, after which he then defied all odds by escaping his captivity, and upon gaining a new lease on life, as well as his freedom from MI6, Raoul questioned how he had earned both, the answer to which turned out to be one word: vengeance. Vengeance against the woman who had crafted him into a perfect tool of espionage, only to cast him aside when he needed her most. And this is what brings us into contact with Raoul during this story. First through his machinations via the heist of the hard drive containing the names of all NATO agents, and then when he has his henchmen rig the explosion of the MI6 headquarters, which cost the lives of 8 agents. But our first encounter with the man himself is found during his own first encounter with none other than James Bond. Entering a barren room filled with hundreds of servers, Raoul saunters towards a bound Bond, sporting a cream-colored suit, dyed platinum blonde hair, and what we can assume to be blue contact lenses. And as he makes his way to his captive, Raoul regales 007 with a tale from his childhood, telling him the story of he and his family's struggle with rats that had invaded a small island they owned, and how they dealt with them. That is, by rigging an oil drum with coconut as bait, so the rats would be trapped inside it, where they would slowly devour one another over the course of a month. When that month was up, they released the 2 surviving rats into the wild to serve as pest control, as now these rats no longer crave the coconut they had gorged themselves on when they first arrived, but rat flesh instead, an artificial change of nature. Raoul likens these 2 rats to himself and Bond, 2 beings who were put in their own barrel drum in the form of the MI6 proving grounds to emerge as deadly killers trained to annihilate anyone, which of course included fellow agents if necessary. This comparison is quite important, as it shows that Raoul, unlike Bond, feels as if he were a person forced to become something he was not, a man with no choice who was led down a path of misery and death to emerge on the other side a victim of that which he had been forced to dedicate his life to. And these feelings, along with his abandonment by the agency and subsequent torture, only amplified his desire for revenge. However, it's interesting to note that who Raoul is at the time of this story is probably not much different from the man he was prior to his torture. Jovial, subtly flamboyant, and reserved, Raoul, who has quite the penchant for showmanship, is unnerving in his quiet confidence and extraordinarily calm and measured in his approach to nearly every situation we find him in throughout this film. During his attempted conversion of Bond to his cause, he shows himself to be quite psychologically sadistic, having having a go at riling up James through the revelation of truth and betrayal, seduction and perversion, and honeypotting and logic, his body language elegant and unnerving as he measures his steps for dramatic effect, eases his posture to disarm his victim, purses his lips to show sickening delight, and uses gentle but deliberate physical touch to shake his victim. And once he releases Bond from his restraints, he continues this streak of sadism with his former lover Severine, a woman he had manipulated into believing he was a kind and loving man, who he is now forcing to be the victim in a proverbial game of knocking the apple off her head with an arrow, to the tune of the upbeat song Boom by Charles Tennant, a song which sings of love and the hearts that serve as its herald with each boom, a boom that echoes the very universe itself. Here we see him exhibiting that same seductive charm he used on Bond moments earlier, giving her one final kiss before he playfully tells her to hold still lest she loses her head in the oncoming game. And when Bond fails to shoot the glass from her head and Raoul is given his turn, he promptly shoots Severine in the chest without so much as blinking an eye. Now it's interesting to note the philosophic qualities that Raoul displays, as prior to engaging in this game, he remarks how the people of the island that they currently occupy, Hashima, left in a hurry when he and his men came to take it over, and the items that these people chose to abandon in their hurried escape is a constant reminder to him to focus on the essentials, to abandon the superfluous, just as he abandoned Severine so easily when she has exhausted her use to him. This notion feeds into the motive he has for living his life, his revenge against M, and this remark exemplifies the simplicity and clarity that he's been given to his existence now that he's been freed of his bond to MI6, a man whose purpose has become so refined that it has become a part of who he is, and not, as is often the case with many who follow this path, a purpose that has consumed his soul and transformed him into a beast of rage. Raoul is still a monster, but he is quite level-headed and methodical, a genius in several ways, who has made a fortune for himself through hacking and espionage, creating an immeasurable source of wealth for himself, a wealth that manifests an enormous amount of power that he uses to enact his dark designs with precision and clarity. And this is plain to see in how far-reaching and intricate his plan to murder M was, one that was years in the making, that showed his vast intellect and strategic mind. Because of his inherent gifts, training, and resources, Raoul actually does something that is quite rare for not just villains in the Bond franchise, but for villains in general. He succeeds in accomplishing his goal in a spectacular show of theatrics, as M perishes from wounds that she sustained while battling against her former protege, although he'll never know that he essentially achieved his victory. Now it's important that we discuss the moral implications of M's abandonment of Raoul and his subsequent quest for revenge. During the course of this film, we're challenged with something that people in law enforcement, the military, or espionage will unfortunately probably have to deal with at some point: the decision to sacrifice one life to save many, and whether doing so is the right thing to do. Now this is a complex topic, and the morality of this concept is dependent on each scenario that it can be found in, so we'll just be focusing on the examples that were given here. Now we're given 3 examples of this in the film: the abandonment of Ronson to his injuries so James can continue his pursuit of Patrice, the accidental shooting of James by Eve, and of course, the abandonment of Silva to the Chinese government to save the lives of 6 agents. Now in the first 2 scenarios, there were ways to prevent the death of Ronson and the shooting of James, and maybe there was another way for Raoul to rectify his situation as well, as just as James could have likely saved Ronson here and still pursued his target to the best of his ability and eventually acquire the hard drive, it's entirely possible that Raoul, who was reportedly an extraordinary agent, could have found a way to save himself from torture and prevent the deaths of his comrades in arms. 6 agents' lives were endangered should Raoul be allowed to walk free from Hong Kong without repercussion. So from M's perspective, the superior on the outside looking in, the most logical course of action to take here is indeed to hand him over to save those 6 lives. The problem we encounter here, and with the similar scenarios James was in, is that cold hard logic often doesn't account for human emotion and individual ingenuity. On the one hand, you can argue that these men have been trained to live and die for the organization they represent, and they should know full well that in these scenarios, their lives are likely going to be forfeit. However, when you employ talented men like James Bond and Raoul Silva, there is always the opportunity for any mission to be completed no matter the odds that are stacked against them. As we see when Patrice gets away with the hard drive after Eve misses him and shoots James instead, the enactment of the most logical solution ended up being an error that didn't allow for any other eventuality to occur that may have entirely changed the outcome of this situation. As 007 said when he confronts M about this after he returns to London, she should have trusted him to finish the job, and maybe she should have, as obviously her approach didn't work, even though it certainly could have if Eve hadn't missed her shot. It's a tricky situation to navigate, and while both sides of this debate have justifications for their arguments, it appears that M doesn't consider something very crucial when making these decisions. That being that even if the people who work for you are expecting to die in action, and shouldn't be surprised when their superiors have to make the choice to sacrifice their lives, that doesn't mean that they'll appreciate it if they believe there are other options available. And clearly, in these scenarios, there definitely were. If you're going to sacrifice the lives of your employees, you better make damn sure that it's the only option you have left, as ostracizing the best people at your employ due to your poor decision-making regarding their lives will only hurt you more than the potential failure of the mission that you so desperately wanted to save by expending them. And this is where the human emotion component comes into play. If you make the wrong call and use this tactic as a third or fourth resort rather than a last, you might just find yourself with a Raoul Silva on your hands, a man who believes there was a different solution to the problem his surrogate mother faced and was instead forced to endure unimaginable suffering because she couldn't see past her own training to recognize that the life that she dangled over the fire was a man who might be utterly crushed to oblivion and filled with hatred should he survive this ordeal. Clearly, there are men like James who can handle such a mistake, and they can understand that it wasn't made lightly, nor with ill intent, but there are others who, and rightly so, can't forgive a person who condemned them to death before they had exhausted every possible solution. So with that in mind, does that make Raoul's mission to murder M righteous and just? No, it doesn't. Yes, he has a serious grievance, but again, it's not as if M gave him up for any sort of malicious reason. She was only operating according to what she believed to be the best course of action. It's not something to be glorified or praised, but neither is it something that one should be condemned to death over, as in the moment, it's hard to know which decision is the right one, and it's often only in hindsight, or with an immense amount of preparation, that you can work out the other possibilities that you couldn't quite see when chaos was presented to you. If anything, Raoul should have returned to MI6, handed in his resignation, perhaps even fought for M's resignation, and demanded enormous compensation for his pain and suffering. And although that would never truly heal the pain he endured, it would be a step in the right direction, making it so he could move on from his horrific experiences and live his life in the healthiest and happiest way that he possibly could. But instead, Raoul chooses to forfeit his life to darkness, and he destroys himself even further than M's abandonment of him had, dedicating his life to revenge and ensuring that it would be a life laden with misery as he made his way to his self-assured destruction. And at this end, who was Raoul Silva? He was a man who was taken when he was young to be molded into the perfect killing machine, an assassin spying on behalf of the British Empire to further their own aims at the expense of his own free will. Wounded beyond measure by the woman that he had come to consider his mother, Raoul became a man focused solely on replacing the blood he had lost with the blood of his surrogate, payment for the suffering he endured and the sin she had committed against not just him, but many other men like him. Raoul Silva, Tiago Rodriguez, did not want to become the monster he became. He was made into it, and though he had the opportunity to free himself from his pain and relinquish his tragic past, he ultimately chose to dedicate his life towards something he had become intimately familiar with: the pursuit of death, and in doing so, he caused undue pain and suffering to dozens, if not hundreds of people, all for the sake of satisfying his own revenge. A man who could not overcome the dark waters of pain that he tread with his body and mind, and instead drowned in them until he was consumed by its evil. Thank you all for tuning in to this episode of Analyzing Evil, and I hope you've enjoyed. What are your thoughts on Raoul? Did I miss anything? Let me know down below, and leave a suggestion for a villain you'd like to see featured while you're at it. If you liked this video, and make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. A big thank you to all of my subscribers, to my patrons, and to anyone who's decided to honor me with a super thank, and a most vile thank you to those whose names you're seeing on screen now. Join the channel's Discord server and Reddit to interact with myself and the community, and follow me on the social media platforms listed below to keep up with the channel. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll be seeing you soon.